Boom! The Power Linguist back. And, okay, so first things first, real name and real photo to post and make comments. This should be a pretty interesting topic, and I'm approaching it because it needs to be approached by a linguist and not by a linguophile and not by hobbyists and people who don't know what they're talking about. And that is, this is a pretty interesting area, really. There's been a lot of speculation, a lot of talk, and it's all been erroneous. That's why you need a real linguist to talk about this, and that is, what is the hardest language in the world? Well, there's a lot of parameters that have to be set, and a lot of things have to be defined before we can really get into that. Number one, the hardest language in the world is going to be relative to what your native language is. So your L1, and I'm going to work from an L1 English. Okay, I could pick some other languages, but definitely I'm very solid on this. So for an English L1 speaker, what is the hardest language in the world to learn? Now, a lot of the linguophiles start talking about a lot of things that are not they don't have a lot to do with really what is the hardest language in the world. They don't know how to think in the grand scheme of languages because they just don't have that sort of ability. They don't have that sort of training. There are over 6,000 languages on the planet right now, and many are dying off as I speak. However, the problem is with the linguophiles that they only consider those languages that are well known, that are large, fairly large. I haven't of course seen everybody's video, but this is a pretty common talk, and all the wannabes and the would-bes and try-to-bes just talk about things they don't know anything about languages. It takes a linguist to do this. Okay, number one, so as an L1 English speaker, you're speaking a language that's not inflectional anymore. Used to be heavily inflectional over 800 years ago. That and Old German. Old English and Old German were fairly similar. English has lost a lot of almost everything of its inflections. It keeps the third-person singular verb change, which a lot of people in the trailer park, it's called trailer park English, are losing and getting wrong and confusing it. Like he don't. How many conjugations are there in English? He doesn't, she doesn't, it doesn't. Okay. They also confuse case. There's what's left now is what's called a nominative or a subjective and an objective case. So objective is at the end. So since English is so syntactical, the word ordering drives people to think certain lexical units should be chosen because of its position in the sentence, although grammatically that is incorrect. So this is why you hear people saying things like it is me. It's not, because actually it is a dummy subject, and it's a transformational. If you use transformational grammar, I use a lot of others, but this is very easy. Chomsky works very well for English. So anyway, I'm using I'm not using minimalism right now, but it is I is correct because you say I am something, so the to be verb changes. It is me. The reason why people think that this is correct is because they're used to saying me or her. It is her. It is she is actually correct because it's a predicate nominative. It's renaming the subject again, and it's a dummy subject, it, which doesn't stand for anything. It's basically she is she. That's what semantically it means, although you don't know that unless you can analyze. See, this is what a linguist can do. I can analyze the language. Kaufman's lost. Benny's lost. Moses is lost. All these other people are lost in this. So anyway, so what happens, what I'm getting to, is that English has become so syntactically driven that the grammar has become syntactically driven. Semantics has become semantically driven. And so people say things like, it's me. Or they'll say things like, her and me went there. Completely wrong. completely wrong. They would not say us went there, but they make an error when it's singular, both singular subjective things. So she and I went there. So what's happening that these cases are in low standard socioeconomic dialects are being ignored in English, and that's for, I like the term actually, trailer park English. Yeah, so the people growing up living in trailer parks are speaking this he don't, and her and me went there, many other errors. But so what I'm trying to get to is that people who have English as an L1 are used to certain ordering of the syntax. So those languages that are not syntactically driven so much in a line, that's what makes English easy to understand between semantically between through homophones such as through, THREW, as in that's and through, THROUGH, that so I threw the ball can only be the THREW, right? And I went through the city. That can only be THROUGH. And speaking of English is so non-phonetical that OUGH can be pronounced so many different ways. You don't learn it as an L1 as a phonetic set of symbols. You learn it by hearing it, seeing it, and being told what the sound is. Anyway, I don't want to get off into phonetics, phonology of English. Geez, that will be here for a month. But the point being is there's certain things you started thinking that's how the world is. The way I've talked about this before, your operating system is hardwired by your first language. And it takes a lot to break out of that. It takes a linguist basically to be able to break out of that. The fact is so that you think that your L1 is normal. That's what you think the world is. You think the world is normal through your L1. So anything that's very different from your L1 is very abnormal and, of course, very hard to accept, and that makes it very difficult to learn. So what a lot of these people have not talked about, they're only talking about languages with scripts. So once again, they think that the hardest language to learn would be another language with a script, incompletely, of a rational thought there. It's not a complete rational thought. The hardest languages for someone who's used to with scripts are languages with no scripts. So, and the hardest language, since you're dealing with a language like English, it's going more and more towards isolating. It's not really an isolating language, not at all. But it's going that way. It's more that way than it is inflectional these days. If you're looking at the spectrum of inflectional languages versus isolating languages. So the point is then that what would be very difficult to learn are polysynthetic languages, where one unit morpheme, they're bound morphemes together. The more morphemes you have, they're called adpositions because they can be in the front. They can be prefixes, infixes, and then suffixes. And the prefixes you can actually stack them. The same thing with infixes and suffixes. And certain languages, polysynthetic, do that. So actually one word has to be translated into English as a sentence or maybe more than one sentence because it contains that much information. Now, this is just one aspect of what would be very difficult language to learn. It would be one that's polysynthetic, that doesn't have a script, and also that uses evidentials, because English doesn't use evidentials. Evidentials are how you know something is real. And that's why in court of law in English, they have things called hearsay. There are languages that when you speak, you tell the listener how you know that information. That's an evidential. And there are particles. There are particles, or there is suffixes or infixes or prefixes that will alert the person to the evidentials. Evidentials are found in a lot of different languages. Another thing is ergativity, absolutive ergativity. You're used to English, which doesn't have this. So there's different grammar construction for those things which are intransitive versus transitive. Or they'll also change depending on if it's a human or a non-human. or if it's animate or non-animate. I can't get into all this because this is linguistics. This is what we do as professional linguists. This is why these people don't know what the hell they're talking about when they're trying to say what's the hardest language. They don't know any of these things to look at. So there's also languages, Australian languages, for example, that encode everything that you say has a reference point from where you started. That's because what's important in that environment is not getting lost in the desert. So it's always a reference point when you talk about something to where you're at, to where you're going. That's important. Those aspects that are important in your environment where the language started are going to be encoded in that language. So, very difficult languages, and the grammars are completely different. There's serial verbs in certain languages. It's a hotly debated topic, by the way, serial verbs. One that I like to get into with people, by the way. But serial verbs are verbs that are put together, and there is no one verb that is the head verb. Head verb means it controls other verbs. In a real serial verb construction, the verbs can be moved around, and they still make sense. Because in English, we'll do things that have adjuncts, or they have locatives attached to them, or they have aspect, time, or modality words that are modals that are connected to them that explain something like there are many languages that explain killing with cause to die, or die to cause, or stuck pig cause to die. Those are all every one of those is a separate verb, but they're put together and they get killed the pig basically in English. But it's more clear on how they did it. They stabbed, and then it caused the pig to die. So those languages like that are much more difficult for English speakers than any other languages. The Russian, none of those languages compare. And if you add tone to these, if you add tone to a polysynthetic language, you got one hell of a problem to learn. That's why it takes a linguist to do it. That's why you don't see you don't see anybody out there, willing to do it. You don't see Kaufman, you don't see Moses, you don't see Benny, you don't see any of these guys willing to learn these languages. So durable, for example, which has been used in a lot of grammar, especially Van Valen's role reference grammar, RRG, as an example of how things operate differently than English, and how this is put here and this is put here, because you can't think in English. You cannot translate from English. This sort of language is the hardest language in the world for an L1 English speaker. It is not Finnish, it is not Hungarian, it is not Russian. It's a polysynthetic tone language that has distinctive differences for the tone also, and doesn't follow, and doesn't have this is another thing. These languages are not SVO. They're not SOV. They're not VSO. They're not VOS. Sometimes the actor, the agent, which you would know as a subject, is not mentioned. And keeping track of who is causing what to whom is very difficult. This is one of the things linguists have to figure out, and they spend a lot of time doing this. That's why only field linguists can handle this sort of thing, because you people who are using teach yourself, ASCII have no damn clue on what to do. So basically, the hardest language in the world for an English speaker is a polysynthetic tone language that has an absolutive ergative grammar system and uses evidentials. All these things are something none of you people, none of these wannabes, try-to-bes, linguophiles, sycophants, troll boys has a clue about. It's only the power linguist setting the record straight here, because it takes the linguist to do this, and boom, I got the power to do that. So you've heard it here. Hardest language for an L1 English speaker is a polysynthetic language. Tone, absolute ergative, split absolute ergative, that'd even be harder. Language. So until next time, check it out, because the Power Linguist is giving you information none of these wannabes, try-to-bes, would-bes, sycophants, linguophile, polyglot, nobody's has a clue about.